Jan first talked to me about doing this and then asked me for a title, I gave her A Blessing in a Great Disguise, a Book, and a Revolution. And I'll probably get to those down at the end, but as I thought through this, it became a little bit broader. And so Be Careless What You Wish For has become the title. And I mean that in every possible way. First, dream big dreams. Just don't get too attached to how they're going to be fulfilled or if they're going to be fulfilled. But dream big dreams, strive for big things. But you never know what life is going to throw at you or what is going to turn out to be that blessing in disguise. I had my first midlife crisis at the age of 24. To explain that, my grandfather died at the age of 48 of a heart attack, or at least so the family lore had it, and I was young enough not to actually do the math. So I grew up believing that, and then when I was a senior in college, my mother died at 51. And so I started to see a pattern here. And so, yeah, midlife came a little early. And unlike what most people think about in terms of midlife crises, I did not buy a sports car and go off on some wild excursion. I came back from my first wild excursion and started teaching. At midlife, I was looking for meaning. And that's been kind of a theme throughout as well. My wife pointed out to me last month when we went back for a reunion at Drake University that when we left Drake, I had a 10-year plan, and that was to teach, to make my living performing, to write, and after 10 years, decide which of those I really wanted to pursue, because I was torn. The other thing that happened as I was thinking about this talk, when Jan says something that you know for sure, I would have been great at this at 24. I just started teaching, so I knew everything about teaching and certainly everything about music. I had read all the books. We were preparing to start a family, and so I had read all the parenting books, and I've completely understood how to raise children. Life has had a way of teaching me humility. So I don't know that this is anything that I know for sure, but I think all we can share at this point, I don't even go for the I'm older and wiser thing, but I can share experiences, I can share stories. And if those stories are somehow instructive, so much the better. So 1975 was a really key year in the development of my life as I now look back on it. On January 5th of that year, I married my wife of now almost 38 years. Three months later, we ran away with the circus. And I'll get back to maybe a little bit of that later on. And at the end of that year, I interviewed for that first teaching job. So it was a formative year in many ways. And I guess if I have a piece of advice, well, I can't say this for sure either. That's the other thing I've learned. But I started out to say, marry someone who challenges your boundaries. Find a life partner that expands you in some way. I wish I could say that I had gone into the search with that in mind. Of course, it happened as randomly as most. So 1975, as it happened, would not have occurred if I had gotten some of my previous wishes. In 1969, as a senior in high school, I wanted more than anything to cap my career as a high school band nerd with one more time in the Iowa All-State Band. I had made the All-State Band as a sophomore, in fact, sat second chair trumpet in that year when I was still second chair trumpet in my own school, and justly so. I just had a really good day for the audition, and Phil, who sat ahead of me, had a really bad day. I had made it again my junior year, a little further down the section. My senior year, did not make it. At that moment, it's one of those Back to the Future moments where my children are fading in the picture. I decided I better quit playing the trumpet before I destroyed music as we know it, because I was going downhill very fast. So I went to school on Monday and told my band director, and he could actually see it before I even started talking. He kind of knew. And he said, well, do you feel like coming to school this Friday? And I went, yeah, not particularly. Why? So, well, they've got this band day thing down at Drake. It's auditions, senior music day. You could take one of your songs that you played back when you could play and audition and just see what happens. Up to that point, I assumed I was going to the University of Iowa. It was a good school, state school that we could afford, and my greatest hope for college was getting a good scholarship to U of I. I went on that Friday. I got out my freshman solo that I had played, took it down and auditioned. The trumpet professor scribbled a quick note, sent me on my way up to the dean, who asked a few pertinent questions and said, I think we can put together a package where you'll be well taken care of. So I went to Drake University. Without that moment, had I made the All-State Band, that moment would not have happened. I would not have gone to Drake. I would not have gotten a work study as the uniform manager, and I would not have met my wife measuring her for her uniform as a freshman. So the marriage would not have happened. I dare say the circus would not have happened. It's not every wife or partner or spouse who, when such an opportunity arises, enthusiastically jumps on board and says, yes, let's do that. You know, it sounds crazy to a lot of people, but it was one of the greatest experiences of our lives. So you never know what little fork in the road is occurring. Life does funny things to you. Don't take any of it too seriously, but kind of listen. So jumping ahead, at 60, I feel like if I were to make a graph of my life, I'm at near one of the higher peaks, and still on an ascending path. Physically, I'm in as good a shape as I've ever been in. That may say something more about the shape I used to be in than it does about today. But mentally, I'm sharp, and I have a job where I get to do what I'm best at and love most every day, making music with kids. It's pretty hard to beat that. But there's a period that, just for the sake of brevity, I'll say was my 40s. That was a much darker time. In between the circus and the young, passionate teacher and those wonderful things, I got very ill in my mid to late 30s, and it affected my equilibrium, and I experienced vertigo with the simple turn of the head. This led to a very sedentary lifestyle, which led to weight gain, depression, etc. So when I was 40 and until not that long ago, I was old, fat, and depressed. And that's a powerful combination. They feed on each other and spiral downward. So in the mid-90s, I finally got to a doctor who properly diagnosed and began treatment of that illness. And one would think there's the happy ending. That took care of the illness and kept it at bay. It's still something that I live with knowing is out there, but we have it in check. But the sedentary lifestyle, the weight, and the depression were still there feeding on each other. It wasn't an immediate turnaround like one might think. And that's where The Blessing in a Great Disguise, the book, and the revolution come in. The blessing is I was diagnosed in 2001 with type 2 diabetes. That doesn't sound like a blessing. My mother died of complications thereof, so at the time, but it certainly got my attention. And I would not have placed a large wager on how this reaction would happen. But as it turns out, I chose to grab life and to take charge and to feel empowered by this to change my life and do something about it. I got on an exercise plan. I did a lot of reading and got my diet together, lost about 50 pounds in about 6 months, and all of a sudden the diabetes is completely under control and I'm active again. The depression is at least easier to manage. From there, I'll skip to the revolution. You may have heard of it, Dance Dance Revolution. Again, the universe sends you strange messages, and you have to kind of watch for them. The first time I became aware of it was in Las Vegas, at the Las Vegas Hilton, as it was called back then anyway. It was late at night, they were closing down the arcade, and there were no kids on this machine. I decided I had to try it. Did so, crashed and burned, but we laughed about it for some time thereafter. Didn't think about it again for a long time, and then a few years ago here, probably 6 or 7 years ago, I can't remember exactly, a colleague and I are walking down by the 400s right before the end of school as they're starting to set things up for Camp Roadrunner. And we noticed motion in the room that seemed a little out of character, as our eyes are wont to do, and then went over and poked our head in, and we saw Dr. Herkstroder and another colleague doing Dance Dance Revolution to check out the equipment that was being set up for the kids to play on during camp. And so we went in and laughed at them, as one might, and they were like, okay, wise guys, your turn. And so I got on it, again, crashed and burned, was soundly defeated, but I found myself an hour later with just a little bit of a sweat on my forehead still, and telling everybody about it and laughing uproariously. So I got on eBay, ordered an old PS2 and the software, and started doing DDR. There's something about exercise and music married together that are the biggest, most effective antidepressant that I have found and have worked for me wonderfully since that time. The book that I mentioned earlier was a thing called Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain, that was floating around at about that time, and I wish I could credit whoever suggested that I read it. It was probably either Amazon.com or Paul Rosenbaum. Those are my main sources. But I've done a lot of reading since on brain research that I love, and if you are into that sort of thing, talk to me. I can suggest several good books. But the power of books to encode something in our brain is tremendous. One more bad example, okay? In the 70s, I read a book called The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. And from that developed a very pessimistic view of the future. Recently, I read a book that I highly recommend called Abundance, The Future is Better Than You Think, by Peter Diamandis, who was the founder of the X Prizes, that really talks about how we are on an exponential path to solving the world's great problems of hunger and poverty and lack of education and water and all the rest of it. And I really highly recommend it. I think going through life optimistically certainly beats the alternative. I hope you've gotten something out of all of this, and thank you for your time.